Tales. 6 programmes presented by Tony Arthur. Programme 5, Landmarks.
Have you ever scrambled up the Herefordshire Beacon and stood on top of the world, driven through Glencoe on a stormy night, rounded a bend of the A303 to see Stonehenge rising out of a dawn mist, or perhaps even watched a fiery November sun set through the black leafless branches of the New Forest? If you have, then you'll understand that feeling of insignificance that drove our ancestors to create tales and legends that attempted to explain their awe-inspiring and frequently terrifying environment.
They're stories told by people who didn't understand the things they saw. I mean, they saw a great big circle of stones, like Stonehenge, very impressive. They didn't realise that they'd been built by ordinary men like them, only with a different set of beliefs. They thought they must have come there by some supernatural force. With Stonehenge, they thought it was Merlin who had conjured them across the sea from Ireland, and they were called the Giants' Dance because they were originally giants, and he'd made the giants move across the sea and then turned them into stone, and there they are.
At one time, legends like those that Catherine Briggs talked about were no doubt accepted as genuine history, but their credibility was gradually eroded until they ended up as just entertaining narratives, such as this folk tale from Sussex, which explains the origin of the famous Devil's Dyke. It's told in a fine, energetic style by Paul Plum.
Well, of course, one of the most famous landmarks and places of legend round about this way is the Devil's Dyke, not far from here, and the legend has it that the old devil thought that the people of Brighton were rather too good. They were rather a lot of God-fearing people, you see, so he thought, well, I can't have this sort of thing in the territory that I'm running around in, so he thought, I'll cut a dick, or a dyke as he called it, you see. And he starts digging away in the early hours of the evening, and when everybody'd gone to bed, and with a view of cutting the people of Brighton off, you see, and cutting this dyke right the way round into the sea, so that let the sea in and everybody would get drowned. Well, anyway, he cuts away and he's digging away there, and all of a sudden he realises the time's got ahead of him a bit like, and he thought he'd better start digging a bit harder, see, so he throws a few extra big lumps around, and that made a few more landmarks in this place called Sussex. For instance, the big lumps that he threw out, one was Sisbury Ring, and the other one was Chanctonbury Ring, and one or two other local hills round about there. There are another lumps of dirt that the old devil threw around in his haste to get the water in, you see. Anyway, he's getting a bit tidy up there for time, and one old lady, she happened to be getting up a bit early one morning. She peers out of her window, and she sees the old devil working away there, and she thinks to herself, well, I can't have this sort of thing. These poor people of Brighton, they're all friends of mine, see? So she goes out in the old shed and she gets a pig's bladder, and she puts a candle behind it, and she holds it up in her window, and which was meant to represent the sun rising, see? And while she goes out and does that, she kicks the old rooster off the old perch, and he gets off there with a bit of a flutter, and he starts crowing away, you see, and the old devil looks up and he sees the old sun there shining, and as it were, you see, and he thought, lummy, the sun's coming up, see, and the old rooster starts to crow, and there he thought, I better pack this lark in. So he takes wings onto himself, and he flies over to Mayfield, and where he landed there's a tidy-sized hole in the ground where the old devil was supposed to land in and gone back home.
The devil is associated with hundreds of topographical legends all over the British Isles. He seems to have spent a great deal of time and energy hurling and kicking rocks around the countryside, on many of which he's left his fingerprints and footprints. He also seems to have been very fond of moving great mounds of earth in his attempts to cover up towns that had irritated him. But luckily, the devil was often surprisingly gullible and could easily be tricked out of his wicked intentions by the shrewd country folk, who'd send him off on all sorts of wild goose chases. In a number of folk tales, the devil is overcome by the holiness of a particular saint. These tales were, naturally enough, encouraged by the church. Here's one that concerns the devil and St Dunstan. In this particular version, according to the storyteller Jeff Burridge, the devil, temptingly disguised as a young, seductive country lass, made St Dunstan an offer he almost couldn't refuse.
My dad told me this story. He was told it when he used to go to school at Mayfield. Apparently, one bright morning when St Dunstan was working in his forge, I don't know what he was doing at the time, but he was probably making a horse hoof or something like that. In came the devil, disguised as a young girl. He came in, wiggling her hips and winking her eyes at him, and tried to get him to go out with her. But old St Dunstan, he wouldn't have it, but he was pretty well tempted. She tried to woo him and woo him and woo him, but he did happen to look down at the ground and noticed that in place of a foot there was a hoof, and with that he knew that she was a devil. He took his tongs, his red hot tongs, from out of his hot coals, pinched her nose tight. Of course she was up and about screaming, and turned back into the devil. Wings was flapping as they was going round the forge, round and round they went, when eventually St Dunstan let go, and with a mighty bound the devil jumped out the door from Mayfield and landed in Tunbridge Wells to bathe his nose in the spa waters. And from this day on, them waters are a rusty colour, tasting of sulphur from the depths of hell.
The devil of folktale shares a lot of characteristics with that other popular creator of impressive hills and rock formations, the giant. Normally, giants and devils stick to their own stories, but there is a tale in which a giant and the old gentleman actually get together for a stone-throwing contest. It came about because the giant of Grabbist, a kindly, church-loving soul, decided that there just wasn't enough room on Exmoor for himself and the devil. So they agreed that each should throw a stone from Bossington Beacon over to Porlock Common, about 4 miles away, which I suppose in giants' terms could be described as just a stone's throw away. Anyway, they agreed that whoever lost would leave the area for good. Well, the devil had the first throw, and his stone shot like a rocket across the 4 miles to Porlock Common. Then it was the giant's turn.
And the giant picked up this enormous big stone, and just as he was getting it balanced and going to make a really good hurl, the devil tripped him up like a mean thing, and he fell flat on his nose, and the devil yelled with laughter. But the giant's Grabbist wasn't to stand that, and he got up and he picked up the devil by the tail, and he carried him at arm's length, kicking and struggling until he got to the coast, and then he twirled the devil 3 times round his head and shot him off. He got nearly to the West Indies, I believe, and it took him a long, long time to swim back again. But he's back now, they say in Somerset, right enough, and no mistake.
The late Catherine Briggs. Although a lot of folk tales are simply explanations of unusual or impressive bits of the countryside, some of them also pointed out a definite moral. Typical of this type are the various stories that describe the plight of a group of dancers whose revelries continued right through Saturday night and on into Sunday morning. For the sin of dancing on the Sabbath, they were invariably turned to stone. Today they stand as silent reminders of the fate awaiting anyone who should ignore the Church's teaching. Probably the most famous of these dancing groups is the Stone Circle at Stanton Drew in Somerset. A young couple got married on Midsummer's Day, which happened to fall on a Saturday, and they went out into the countryside with a fiddler to hold their wedding party.
They were a very merry party, and they went out with the fiddler to dance on the plain there, and danced very, very merrily, and the bride was very uplifted and excited, and she was a very keen dancer. And at 5 minutes to 12, a cock crowed, and the fiddler, who was a very decent Sabbath-keeping fiddler, put up his fiddle and said, "I can't go on fiddling now because it will be breaking the Sabbath." And the girl said, "Oh, you must go on fiddling." And the dancers all came round the fiddler and tried to bully him, but he wouldn't budge. As soon as the first stroke of the bell on the church rang, he put up his fiddle, and they were furious. And then another fiddler turned up, much sprucer and more sophisticated than that old fiddler, and said, "I'll fiddle for you if you like." And they were delighted, and the girl seized her partner again, and they all got into a big circle, and he played a very stately step like a pavane, very slowly. The girl said, "No, go quicker than that, much quicker." And he said, "Very well." And he went quicker, and so quickly that they couldn't keep their feet practically. They whirled round and round, but they couldn't stop dancing, and they yelled and cried to him. But on they danced until the sun rose next morning, and when the cock crew, there they were, a circle of stones.
London Drew in the county of Somerset, that's where the devil played at his request. They paid the price for dancing on a Sunday, ever as stones they stand at rest. They dance, dance, dance around, they dance, dance to the pillar sound.
And they're still standing there, forever frozen in the middle of their dance. And as you heard, the legend has now become a song, and that version was sung by the Yetis. When my husband Dave Arthur and I were working on these programmes, I asked him what other sorts of belief are attached to the stones.
Well, there are hundreds of stone circles and stone groups all over Great Britain, and I'd think that most of them had at least one sort of legend or tradition attached to them. One very common property, of course, is that stones can cure all sorts of diseases, and particularly things like rickets in children, which was a very common complaint at one time. In some places, to be really cured, the child or the sick person had to be actually passed through a hole in the stone. But apparently in Cornwall, some of the stones didn't accept this or didn't work if the child was illegitimate or if its parents weren't of good standing. I'm not quite sure what they meant by good standing, but obviously the stones down there had some sort of moral code of their own. And Stonehenge has also been credited with sort of curative powers, and people used to go and grind bits of the stone off or chip bits of the stone off and mix it with water and take it for all sorts of illnesses, to cure all sorts of illnesses. And in fact, at one time I heard that one of the owners of Stonehenge actually used to hire out hammers to people so they could go and chip pieces off, which is of course why we've ended up now by sticking barbed wire around it.
And up in the Orkneys, there used to be another famous healing stone with a hole in the middle, known as the Odin stone at Stenness. But it wasn't just used for healing, for this one was also known as the Lover's Stone. Originally, it was part of two stone circles, one called the Moon and the other the Sun circle. A young man, on the eve of his wedding, would pray for his future happiness in the Sun circle, while the bride-to-be visited the Moon circle. Then, together, they'd go to the Lover's Stone, and standing on either side, they'd clasp their hands through the hole to seal their love, or so the story goes. Some stones, according to Wilf Norman, are even said to move about.
On Thorn Farm,